Jonathan Carter, an African-American and one of the city's most renowned lawyers, stood at the entrance of an upscale boutique late in the evening. The street around him was almost deserted. Only a few cars sped by, their headlights casting long beams of light on the wet asphalt. The weather was cool, the air hinted at the onset of autumn, and a light breeze subtly ruffled his coat. Neon lights from the shop windows reflected in dark puddles, creating a whimsical play of light and shadow. Jonathan had an impeccable reputation as a fighter for justice, defending the rights of minorities and striving for true equality in the city. His eyes burned with an unwavering confidence that had helped him win the most complex legal battles. Today, he was there on business. His assistant, Andrew, was supposed to deliver important documents for an upcoming court session. The streets around him were quiet and seemed serene, but there was tension hidden in the silence. This area was known for its luxury and prosperity, but was also marked by a subtle hostility toward anything unfamiliar. Rare passers-by who occasionally appeared here would hurry to move out of sight. In this place, everyone knew everyone, and any new face automatically aroused suspicion. Jonathan understood that his presence here caused bewilderment and distrust. He knew that many did not see him as a successful lawyer with countless victories, but rather as a stranger who did not fit into the usual order. He glanced at his phone, its glow lighting up his resolute face. Andrew had not sent any messages, and Jonathan began to worry. The wind picked up, sweeping through the street and fluttering his coat. The night air was cold, but he maintained an outward composure, showing no signs of fatigue or concern. He had been taught to always be prepared for the unexpected, and to maintain self-control in any situation. From afar, heavy footsteps broke the fragile silence of the night. Jonathan turned his head and saw the figure of a police officer approaching. Thomas Grant, a white man with stern features and a wary gaze, walked confidently, his tall figure accentuated by his uniform jacket. Grant had been patrolling this area for several years and was used to monitoring every corner of the streets. He knew all the regulars in the neighborhood and looked at any newcomer with suspicion. Seeing a lone man standing by the window at such a late hour, his instincts kicked in. The officer came closer, his steps slowed, and his hand rested on the belt near his flashlight. It was a movement he made automatically when sensing a potential threat. Grant was self-assured and accustomed to having his decisions unquestioned. However, now, as he approached Jonathan, he felt a vague unease. A stereotypical image formed instantly in his mind. An expensive suit, late at night, no one else around. It all made him wary. Jonathan watched the officer's approach and felt the tension grow inside him, though he outwardly maintained a calm demeanor. He could hear each step echoing off the walls of the surrounding buildings. This was not the first time he had faced prejudice, but each encounter left a bitter taste of disappointment. He knew that behind him was a long history of success and recognition, but in moments like these, all of that seemed irrelevant. The streetlights cast long shadows on the wet pavement, highlighting the sharp features of the officer's face and Jonathan's tall silhouette. Their eyes held different kinds of confidence, one with the confidence of power and authority, the other with the confidence of knowledge and experience. Between them was a silent tension, an invisible line that, if crossed, could spark a confrontation. Grant stopped a few steps away, studying Jonathan. His eyes reflected a mixture of suspicion and wariness. Jonathan knew that every second of silence was filled with unspoken accusations and judgments. He could see the officer assessing him, his gaze moving from the dark shoes to the precise line of his shoulders. It was the look of someone used to control and power. The air around them seemed to thicken, becoming heavy and dense. Jonathan felt the tension in his body despite his composed posture. He understood that the situation could unfold unpredictably. The officer standing before him did not know his name, did not know how many cases Jonathan had won, or how many people he had defended. To him, Jonathan was just a man who didn't fit the familiar picture of this street. As Thomas Grant continued to scrutinize Jonathan, the silence of the night felt deafening, The faint rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant sound of car horns, all seemed muted. A hardness appeared in Grant's eyes. He was ready to act if the situation required. Jonathan saw this and knew that every word and action would be interpreted through the lens of that gaze. These moments, which seemed endless, were filled with each man's internal monologue. Jonathan thought about how many more such encounters he would have to endure, how many times he would need to prove his place in society despite all his achievements. Grant, on the other hand, saw in Jonathan an unknown that needed clarification, but his views and doubts were rooted in biases deeply embedded in his mind. The heavy atmosphere around them thickened, turning this brief episode into a symbol of the deeper issue Jonathan had faced his entire life. And in that moment, he realized that this night could mark the beginning of something much greater than a simple check. Jonathan Carter maintained an outward calm, but felt the tension rising. Officer Thomas Grant stood opposite him, his gaze cold and assessing. Grant approached, and his wariness grew with each passing second. The situation suddenly crossed a line when Grant demanded identification, giving Jonathan no time to explain. Jonathan had faced unjust treatment before and understood that his refusal to hand over documents, grounded in his confidence in being right, could be perceived as defiance. The officer, used to complete compliance, instantly interpreted it as resistance. The irritation and distrust in Grant's eyes quickly shifted to aggression, and he took action. Without warning, the officer grabbed Jonathan's arm and yanked him down, forcing him to lose his balance and fall to his knees. Time slowed down. Pain shot through Jonathan's wrists as the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked shut with a sharp sound, leaving red marks on his skin. Everything around him seemed to lose focus. Sounds merged into a monotonous hum, and it felt as if the world had shrunk to this scene. Passers-by began to stop, some watching in surprise as the well-known lawyer, accustomed to defending the rights of others, found himself in the role of a victim. Phone cameras flashed, capturing every moment. Onlookers whispered anxiously, some expressing confusion and outrage. "Isn't that Carter, the famous lawyer?" Voices murmured in the crowd. People knew him, knew that he fought for equality and justice. Seeing him in such a position was a shock for many. Yet no one intervened. The habit of avoiding trouble and a silent fear of the police were stronger than the desire to step in. Jonathan tried to remain calm, his breathing uneven, but his gaze stayed clear. He showed no fear or pain, only focus and a readiness to endure what was happening. His mind raced, thinking about the potential consequences of this incident and how to use it to shed light on the injustices people faced daily. Meanwhile, Grant, feeling the weight of his actions, began to realize he had made a mistake. He glanced at the handcuffs binding Jonathan's wrists and felt cold sweat run down his back. Anxiety gripped his chest, but the fear of losing authority and appearing weak kept him from acting immediately. The crowd around them grew louder. Some voiced their support for Jonathan. Others expressed dissatisfaction with the officer's actions. The noise intensified, and the situation threatened to escalate into chaos. One witness, an elderly man with gray hair, boldly stepped forward and shouted, "He did nothing wrong. Let him go." This statement drew even more attention, and people began to shout questions and comments. Officer Grant nervously glanced around, his eyes darting from face to face. He realized that the situation was spiraling out of control. He quickly took out his radio and called for backup, his voice strained and trembling. "We need crowd control," he muttered under his breath. A few more minutes passed before Grant, fully grasping the gravity of his actions, finally unlocked the handcuffs. Jonathan's wrists throbbed, the skin rubbed raw and marked with red streaks. But he stood tall, holding his head high. He slowly turned to face the crowd, meeting the eyes of people whose expressions were filled with sympathy and confusion. Officer Grant stood motionless, his face deathly pale. He knew there would be no hiding what had happened, that his actions had already become public knowledge. Cameras continued recording, capturing every second, and Grant realized that every move he made from now on would be scrutinized. Jonathan slowly stepped away from the officer, glanced at the people around him, and sighed, feeling the anger and resolve burning inside him. This incident would not go unnoticed. He knew this story would have a continuation, and he was determined to ensure that justice prevailed. Jonathan Carter sat in his office, reflecting on the events of the previous evening. The pain in his wrists from the handcuffs reminded him of the unjust treatment, and anger filled him. Despite the physical exhaustion, Jonathan felt that silence was no longer an option. This was not just an incident, it was a symbol of the discrimination and bias that thousands of people faced daily. Andrew, his loyal assistant, entered the office and noticed the tension in his boss's eyes. He silently placed a cup of hot coffee in front of Jonathan, as if trying to bring him back to reality. The office was filled with the sound of ringing phones and notifications, drawing attention to the fact that the situation had escalated beyond a private incident and was turning into something bigger. Jonathan opened his laptop and began drafting a statement for the press. Each word was imbued with emotion, but remained clear and impeccable. He knew that this speech would become a catalyst for change, but he also anticipated the resistance his actions would provoke. The city, despite viewing itself as progressive, harbored many latent prejudices and resisted change. This was an opportunity to give a voice to those who had been silenced for too long. The press conference was scheduled for the end of the day. The office buzzed with the sound of phones, messages, and the chatter of journalists flocking to the building. The crowd outside grew larger. Reporters set up their cameras, and local residents, having heard about the scandal, came to support or simply witness the event firsthand. Many held signs with slogans about justice and equality. The signs read messages like "Justice for All" and "Stop Racial Discrimination." Jonathan stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. His gaze was focused and serious. He recalled all the times his clients had spoken about unfair treatment, wrongful detentions, and how difficult it was to prove their innocence. Now he found himself in their place, and it strengthened his resolve. He knew that by making this public statement, he was risking not only his reputation, but also his career. Doubts flickered in his mind, but he quickly dismissed them. This step was necessary not just for him, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Employees and volunteers hurried to help prepare the stage for the speech. The anticipation in the office was palpable. Some whispered about possible outcomes. Others printed copies of the statement to distribute to journalists. Andrew, always attentive to details, checked the microphones and sound system. He knew that even the slightest mistake could affect how Jonathan's speech was received. Stepping up to the microphone, Jonathan surveyed the crowd. Camera flashes lit up, capturing his image. The people's eyes were filled with anticipation, a mix of anger and curiosity. Jonathan began speaking, and his voice rang out clearly, despite the inner turmoil. He recounted how he was stopped and arrested without cause, despite his attempts to explain his actions. He described how prejudice and false assumptions could lead to tragedies, and how this situation was not unique. It was just one of many instances where the color of someone's skin became a reason for suspicion and violence. His words spread through the crowd, creating waves of indignation and support. People whispered among themselves, and some shouted words of encouragement. Local activists and community leaders moved closer to express their agreement. The atmosphere was charged to the limit, and news of Jonathan's speech quickly spread across social media and news outlets. In every corner of the street, someone was watching the broadcast, discussing it with friends and neighbors. Jonathan felt that his words had stirred something greater than mere interest. They had touched the hearts and minds of people who were tired of staying silent. They saw him not just as a lawyer, but as someone willing to use his experience and knowledge to fight for justice. However, among the supportive faces were those who looked at him with distrust and skepticism. Not everyone was ready to acknowledge the problem. Not everyone wanted change. Among the attendees stood representatives of the city administration and police. Their expressions were stern and closed. They knew that this statement would spark discontent within their ranks. The police chief, Captain Harris, was among them, assessing the situation and understanding that this was only the beginning of a long confrontation. After the speech, Jonathan returned to his office. He was surrounded by colleagues and friends, some congratulating him on his courage, others cautiously reminding him of the possible consequences. Andrew appeared equally worried and inspired. He stepped closer and whispered, "Now the hardest part begins." Jonathan nodded silently, knowing that this was true. News headlines read, "Famous lawyer Carter takes on police misconduct." Explosive statement on discrimination. Social media was flooded with comments. Some supported Jonathan, others accused him of inflaming the situation. Threats and accusations appeared, but so did calls for solidarity. People began organizing rallies in support of Jonathan and his fight for justice. Jonathan realized that he had taken a step from which there was no turning back. He felt the weight of responsibility, but knew he had acted correctly. His life would now revolve around this incident and the fight for change. He looked out the window at the city he had defended in court and felt a new surge of energy. This fight was just beginning, and he was ready to meet its challenge. Throughout the day following the press conference, the city could not stop discussing Jonathan's statement. A wave of public outrage swept over administrative buildings. Social media exploded with comments, and phone call after phone call came into Jonathan's office. He knew that his statement would not go unnoticed and was prepared for the authorities' reaction. However, the tension and pressure grew with each passing hour. Captain David Harris, the city's police chief, was known for his hardline stance and commitment to maintaining order at any cost. His office was tense that morning. He listened to the radio, where Jonathan's recent words were being debated, and saw before him reports and summaries filled with angry comments and demands for an investigation. His face was stony, but emotions simmered within. The acknowledgement from the well-known lawyer had placed the police under intense public scrutiny, and Harris knew that the situation was slipping out of control. Meanwhile, Jonathan sat at his desk, rereading the letters of support he had received from various community organizations and activists. These words, though reassuring, could not dull the weight of the days to come. He knew that his meeting with Captain Harris would be a pivotal moment in this confrontation. When the time for the meeting arrived, Jonathan headed to the police headquarters. The building's cool, imposing walls seemed to absorb the tension. Muted conversations of staff echoed in the corridors, only to fall silent as Jonathan passed, eyes following him with curiosity. Harris waited in his office, seated behind a massive oak desk scattered with papers and reports. Harris looked up as Jonathan entered. His gaze was heavy, and silence immediately settled, thick and tense. Both men knew this conversation would not be easy. Jonathan sat across from him, feeling the cold of the wood through his suit. He noticed a few officers outside the door glancing in surreptitiously, their curiosity barely concealed. The police chief began speaking, his voice even but laced with subtle reproach. He explained that internal investigations were always conducted according to protocol, and that Jonathan's public statement had cast a shadow over the entire police force. His words carried an implicit threat, underscoring that such an action could have serious consequences, not only for Jonathan's career, but for the city's peace. Jonathan listened intently, without interruption. He understood that this was not just a discussion of facts, but a psychological tug-of-war. Harris emphasized the need to maintain trust, but Jonathan knew that trust was more than just a word. It was something built over years and shattered by a single wrong action. When Harris finished, a silence followed that seemed endless. Jonathan knew it was time to take the initiative. He spoke, describing how the incident was a reflection of a broader problem that had long simmered in the city. Police officers making decisions based on stereotypes and biases was not an isolated event, but a systemic issue that demanded transparency and honesty. Harris had to acknowledge that public attention had drawn too many eyes, and any attempt to cover up the matter could spell disaster for the department's reputation. He looked pensively at the papers before him, weighing his next moves. The officers outside exchanged glances, aware that the conversation behind closed doors marked the beginning of something bigger. Jonathan saw the internal struggle in Harris's expression. The fear of maintaining order clashed with the need to show that the police were capable of self-reflection and change. Deep down, Harris understood that yielding to public pressure would mean admitting weakness, something that contradicted everything he had been taught. The conversation stretched on for hours. Both men presented their arguments, each trying to convince the other of his perspective. Jonathan emphasized that this case could become a pivotal turning point if the police chose to act transparently and openly. Harris, in turn, defended the department's right to conduct its own investigation without public interference. By the end of the meeting, the outcome was far from clear. Harris held firm to his views, but the tension showed in his clenched fists and anxious eyes. Jonathan left the office, sensing that greater resistance awaited him, but also knowing that this meeting had pushed the system toward inevitable change. As he walked back to his office, Jonathan noticed how people on the streets looked at him differently, some with hope, others with skepticism. The word had spread quickly, and now expectations were high. This was only the beginning of a long struggle, but Jonathan was ready to continue his path, despite all difficulties and threats. After the tense meeting with Captain Harris, Jonathan realized that the fight was just beginning. Despite resistance from the police and political figures, he understood that thousands of people were behind him, waiting for change. Events began to unfold at an unprecedented pace. Messages and video recordings of the press conference spread across social media, creating a wide-reaching resonance. Citizens who had previously remained indifferent to such incidents now took to the streets, united by a sense of injustice and outrage. Protests erupted throughout the city. Initially, they were peaceful gatherings where people held signs with phrases like "Justice for All" and "Stop Discrimination." These rallies became platforms for speeches by community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens whose voices had not been heard before. Around Jonathan, a circle of allies formed, representatives of various organizations ready to support his demands for accountability. In his office, Jonathan worked tirelessly. His room resembled a command center. Documents, photos, and letters from citizens demanding justice were scattered everywhere. Andrew helped him sort through the letters and organize meetings with key figures. Each day began with planning the next action or press conference, strategizing, and responding to media requests. At one of the rallies held in the city center, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes approached Jonathan. Her story was typical, yet no less painful. Her son had once been detained without cause, and since then, he had faced difficulties at work and in life. This case, like many others, highlighted how deeply rooted racial bias was in the system. Jonathan listened intently, knowing that each such story was another argument in his fight. The media covered the events almost non-stop. Television channels broadcast debates between supporters and opponents of reform, and newspapers published articles about Jonathan Carter as a symbol of a new movement for justice. His face became recognizable, and his name became synonymous with the fight against racial discrimination. However, not everyone supported his initiatives. The police union began actively opposing the proposed reforms. In their statements, they argued that such actions could undermine the morale of officers, hinder their duties, and lead to increased crime rates. Articles started to appear that sought to discredit Jonathan, portraying his actions as an attempt to destabilize the city. Some city council members openly expressed doubts about the need for the proposed changes, fearing political repercussions. Despite this, the protests continued. Hundreds of people gathered in the square in front of City Hall, demanding transparency and justice. New leaders emerged among the activists, ready to support Jonathan and call for action. The youth who saw Jonathan as an example of resilience and courage became a key driving force in the push for change. They organized marches, held meetings, and discussions where issues of systemic discrimination, long kept silent, were raised. Jonathan knew that every day of delay played into the hands of his opponents. The authorities and the police department tried to calm the situation, by assuring the public that an internal investigation had begun and measures would be taken. But he knew that behind these promises could be another attempt to stall the process and let it fade away. Therefore, he continued to insist on the creation of an independent committee and the transparency of police actions. Under pressure from protesters and the public, city officials began to acknowledge that the situation could no longer be ignored. City council members who had previously avoided making statements began calling for discussions on reform. The police chief, realizing that continued resistance could lead to greater public discontent, agreed to hold an open session to discuss Jonathan's proposals. The city council meeting, attended by key city figures, police representatives, and community activists, became the central event of the week. The atmosphere was tense. Before the session began, a crowd gathered outside the building, eager to show their support for Jonathan and his demands. Some held photos of loved ones who had suffered from the system's injustices. Jonathan stood before the chamber, waiting for the session to start. He saw the faces of people outside the windows, heard their shouts and words of encouragement. He understood that the responsibility for what would happen next rested on him and his resolve. This day could become a turning point in his fight for justice and equality. With each passing day, the pressure on Jonathan and his supporters increased. Although the protests continued and the public supported the reforms, the first serious signs of internal resistance began to appear. The police union, which held significant influence in the city, launched campaigns against the proposed changes, claiming they undermined the authority of the police and restricted their ability to protect citizens. In private circles, there were discussions about how officers themselves felt betrayed and unfairly accused. Jonathan knew that resistance was inevitable, but he did not expect it to be so fierce. Anonymous threats aimed at intimidating him and making him back down began to surface. Political opponents, who had previously remained neutral, now voiced criticism of his approach, claiming he was sowing discord and creating a dangerous precedent. The city press published articles attempting to undermine trust in Jonathan, depicting him as someone using personal tragedy for political gain. Meanwhile, spontaneous meetings began to take place in police stations. Officers discussed the situation, expressing concern that their daily work might become the subject of intense scrutiny and criticism. Some felt humiliated and afraid of new regulations that, in their view, put them at a disadvantage in the face of potential threats. Shift leaders and unit commanders tried to reassure their subordinates, insisting that the reform would be discussed and softened, but the overall tension grew. Jonathan continued working in his office, surrounded by documents and letters of support. Andrew, his assistant, noticed how fatigue was starting to take its toll on his boss. His movements became slower, and his gaze more focused, as if each step required immense effort. Nevertheless, Jonathan showed no sign of doubt. He knew that at any moment his actions could be scrutinized by both the public and the authorities. At another meeting with activists and community leaders, they discussed the next steps. Among those present were new faces, people whose loved ones had suffered from police brutality or injustice. They shared their stories, fueling the resolve to fight to the end. The discussions were heated, with ideas put forward for even larger-scale actions, including organizing nighttime marches with lanterns and candles symbolizing hope for change. At the same time, the police union and its allies launched public campaigns aimed at discrediting Jonathan and his supporters. Press conferences were held, where union leaders claimed that the reforms undermined officer morale and led to an increase in refusals to perform patrol duties. Some officers openly expressed their dissatisfaction in interviews, saying that their safety and that of their families was at risk due to attempts to change the system. At one city council session, dedicated to discussing the reforms, the atmosphere was extremely tense. Jonathan, sitting at the table, felt the eyes of his opponents on him. The head of the police union, a tall man with sharp features, delivered a fiery speech, claiming that such measures would lead to division and worsen relations between the police and the public. He argued that if these reforms were adopted, The city risked losing control over its safety. Jonathan listened to his speech with icy composure. He understood that many present feared change, feared losing familiar mechanisms of power. However, he also knew that these fears stemmed not so much from concerns about safety as from an unwillingness to take responsibility for past mistakes. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up and presented his arguments in a restrained and clear manner, emphasizing that the reforms were not intended to weaken the police, but to strengthen trust and improve interaction with the community. His words sparked a wave of discussion. Council members exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, while others frowned in irritation. But most importantly, Jonathan saw that his voice had been heard. He knew that many more challenges lay ahead, but he was ready to face them to achieve justice. The City Council session dedicated to discussing Jonathan's reforms became one of the most anticipated events in recent months. Against the backdrop of ongoing protests and growing public pressure, the atmosphere in the council building was tense. The hall was filled with police representatives, activists, journalists, and local residents who came to witness the unfolding events firsthand. Jonathan Carter, composed and focused, stood to the side, observing the arrivals. He saw familiar faces, community organization representatives who had spoken at rallies, parents who had lost children to police violence, and legal colleagues supporting him in this fight. But he also noticed the discontented looks of police officers and officials who saw his actions as a threat to their established order. The session began with heated debates. The first speaker was a representative of the police union, a man with a booming voice and confident gestures who took every opportunity to emphasize that the reform threatened the city's stability. He argued that the new rules proposed by Jonathan would create an atmosphere of fear among officers and strip them of the ability to act effectively in dangerous situations. His words resonated with a group of officers in the audience. They nodded, exchanged glances, and quietly discussed his points. Jonathan did not let this speech go unanswered. He stood up and calmly walked to the podium. His voice was firm but not aggressive as he spoke about the numerous cases that underscored the need for change. He talked about people who had lost trust in law enforcement and those who feared seeking help due to concerns of bias. The discussion continued, filled with emotional speeches from both sides. Police representatives and council members supporting the union argued that the reforms would restrict their actions and jeopardize safety. They cited examples where, in their view, strict measures were justified and spoke about the challenges officers faced on duty. On the other side, activists and members of the community who had suffered reminded everyone that these so-called justified measures often ended in tragedy. They shared personal stories, mothers who had lost sons, witnesses of unwarranted violence, and those who had endured humiliation and harassment. At one point, the debate reached a climax when a council member suggested postponing the vote to study all aspects of the reforms. This idea sparked an outcry among the public gathered outside the building. People demanded action, shouting slogans and raising signs calling for justice. Jonathan stood up again. His voice was confident, but fatigue was evident. He reminded everyone of his experience and why he was there. Each word carried weight as he spoke about how change could not wait. He stressed that postponing the vote signaled a willingness to turn a blind eye to real problems that needed to be addressed. In the end, under public pressure and after hours of debate, the City Council agreed to hold the vote. The decision was made. The reform would be implemented. An independent oversight committee would be empowered. Mandatory bias prevention training would become standard, and the reporting system would be transparent. When the results were announced, the hall erupted with mixed emotions. Some applauded, others whispered their discontent. But Jonathan stood in his place, feeling that, despite the resistance and difficulties, the first step had been taken. He knew that there was still a long road ahead with many obstacles, but this day marked a turning point in his fight for equality and justice. The implementation of the reforms marked a turning point for the entire city, After the decision to establish an independent oversight committee and introduce mandatory training programs for police officers, the first steps toward realization began. Jonathan Carter, though feeling some relief, understood that the real work was just beginning. The city watched with bated breath for the initial results, closely following each step in the process of change. Social media and the press continued to actively discuss recent events. Public support was evident. People took to the streets with signs calling for justice and equality, shared their stories, and expressed their emotions and hopes. However, alongside this support, there were critics. Police officers dissatisfied with the changes voiced concerns that their work would become too complicated and restricted. Some even staged symbolic protests, emphasizing that the new system could undermine their ability to respond effectively in emergencies. Jonathan, as always, was at the center of the events. His days were filled with meetings with community organization representatives, council members, and key figures from the independent committee. He knew that every word and action of his was now under a microscope, and any sign of weakness could give opponents of the reforms a reason to attack. Despite this, Jonathan remained steadfast, understanding that this was not just about his reputation, but the future of an entire generation. One of the first tasks of the independent committee was to conduct a detailed review of the case of Officer Thomas Grant, who had become a symbol of excessive force and bias within the police. The committee, which included lawyers, community representatives, and human rights experts, carried out an extensive investigation. Eyewitness testimony, video recordings, and reports formed the basis of their analysis. The process was public, drawing even more attention from city residents. Grant seemed to be under unimaginable pressure. His face had become familiar to every resident, and his name was associated with police aggression. During hearings held in a hall full of journalists and concerned citizens, he appeared worn out, his confidence visibly diminished. This was a pivotal moment, demonstrating that power could no longer act with impunity. Simultaneously, Jonathan actively participated in developing new training programs for police officers. Bias prevention specialists conducted seminars and workshops aimed at rethinking approaches to community engagement. These changes were not easy. Some officers refused to participate, claiming their experience and skills were being called into question. This only underscored how deeply rooted old attitudes were and how difficult the path to true change would be. Despite the resistance, the changes gradually began to bear fruit. Residents of the city noticed that interactions with the police became calmer and more considerate. New practices aimed at conflict de-escalation were introduced in police stations, and cases of unjustified use of force began to decline. City officials, once skeptical, started to acknowledge that the reforms were yielding results. At the conclusion of this difficult journey, Jonathan gathered representatives of key organizations and activists to summarize the first months of the committee's work and the new programs. The room was filled with an atmosphere of relief and hope. The speeches of the participants were full of gratitude and determination to continue the path of change. One memorable moment was the speech of a mother who had lost her son years ago due to a police mistake. She thanked Jonathan for his resilience and courage in pushing through reforms that now gave other families a chance to live without fear. It was a moment that filled everyone present with a deep sense of connection and confidence that change was possible. Jonathan left the hall feeling a renewed energy. He knew that there was still a long road ahead, but this was only the beginning. The city had taken its first steps toward equality and justice, and Carter was ready to lead it forward, knowing that he had the support of the people who believed in a better future.